Sometimes it takes just one moment of kindness to understand that we are not alone in this world. Sometimes the person who looks poorest carries the greatest wealth in their heart. Martin was a young waiter, tired by life and debts that suffocated him every single day. He worked in a small restaurant where time moved slowly and hope even more slowly. One rainy evening, an old man came in, quiet and humble, ordering only tea and a piece of bread. Martin served him with a smile, even though he himself had reason to cry. When the old man left, he left behind a tip on the table that changed everything. It was not just money. It was a story about a lost father, a hidden secret, and love stronger than time. Before we continue, write in the comments where you are watching from, and if you believe in the power of kindness, give us a like and subscribe to our channel. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the streets of Riverside into rivers of grey water that reflected the dim glow of streetlights. Martin Novak stood behind the counter of the Blue Haven Diner, watching droplets race down the front window, wondering if the weather outside matched the storm brewing in his own life. He was 28 years old, though some days he felt twice that age. The diner was nearly empty, as it usually was on Wednesday evenings, when the cold seeped through every crack in the old building and made even the warmest coffee feel insufficient against the chill. Martin wiped down the same spot on the counter for the 3rd time, his movements automatic, born from 5 years of repetition in this exact place. The Blue Haven had been his home away from home since he dropped out of university to care for his mother during her final illness. That was 5 years ago, 5 years that felt like both a moment and a lifetime. His mother had passed 3 years back, leaving him with medical bills that seemed to grow like weeds, no matter how many extra shifts he picked up. The diner smelled of old grease and burnt coffee, scents that had become so familiar they no longer registered except when he came back after a day off, and the assault of familiarity hit him fresh. The owner, Mrs. Helena Kovar, was a woman in her 60s with silver hair she kept in a tight bun and eyes that had seen too much of the world to be surprised by anything anymore. She treated Martin fairly, paid him on time, and never asked questions about why a university-educated young man was content to spend his days serving meatloaf and coffee to travelers passing through a town that existed only because the highway cut through it. Helena was in the back office now, counting receipts from the lunch rush, which had been modest at best. Business had been declining for 2 years, ever since the new bypass opened 5 miles east, diverting most of the traffic away from Riverside's main street. Martin glanced at the clock above the coffee station. 7:15 in the evening. In another 2 hours, and 45 minutes, he could lock the doors, clean up, and walk the 6 blocks to his apartment, a studio above the hardware store that cost more than it was worth, but was all he could afford. His landlord, Mr. Dvorak, had been patient about late payments, but that patience was wearing thin. Martin owed him $800, 2 months' rent that he simply did not have. On top of that, there was the credit card debt, nearly $4,000 accumulated during his mother's illness when insurance covered only a fraction of what the hospital demanded. Every month he paid the minimum, watching the balance barely budge while interest piled on like snow in a blizzard. The door chimed, pulling Martin from his thoughts. A young couple entered, shaking rain from their jackets, laughing about something private between them. They took a booth by the window, and Martin brought them menus, his professional smile fixed in place. They ordered burgers and fries, diet sodas, nothing complicated. He put their order through the window to Yosef, the cook who had worked at the Blue Haven for 15 years, and could prepare every item on the menu with his eyes closed. Yosef was a man of few words, communicating mostly in grunts and nods, but he was reliable, and his food was consistently decent, which was all anyone could ask from a roadside diner. Martin returned to his post behind the counter, his mind drifting as it often did during the slow hours. He thought about his father, a man he barely remembered. Viktor Novak had left when Martin was only 4 years old, disappearing one autumn morning without explanation or goodbye. His mother never spoke badly of Viktor, which Martin found both admirable and frustrating. She would only say that sometimes people need to find their own way, that his father had demons he was fighting, and that leaving was not about not loving them, but about not being able to stay. Martin had spent his childhood and adolescence constructing elaborate fantasies about his father, imagining him as a secret agent, an explorer, a man on some noble quest that prevented him from returning. As he grew older, the fantasies faded and were replaced by a duller ache, a simple absence that never quite healed. His mother, Anna, had worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, cleaning houses during the day and working nights at a factory that produced textiles. She was a small woman with strong hands and an even stronger will, never complaining, always making sure Martin had what he needed, even when she went without. She encouraged his education, dreaming of the day he would graduate university and build a life better than hers. When she got sick, cancer that started in her lungs and spread with cruel efficiency, Martin did not hesitate. He left his studies, came home, and devoted himself to caring for her. She fought for 2 years, enduring treatments that left her weak and hollow, and in the end, she died in the small house where Martin had grown up, holding his hand and telling him she was proud of the man he had become. After her death, Martin sold the house to pay off some of the medical debt, moving into the studio apartment where every corner reminded him of what he had lost. He kept working at the diner because it was steady, because Helena was kind, and because he did not have the energy to imagine anything different. His friends from university had moved on, taking jobs in the capital city or abroad, sending occasional messages that grew less frequent with time. Martin did not blame them. He had become a ghost of his former self, too tired and too burdened to maintain connections that required energy he no longer possessed. The young couple finished their meal, left a modest tip, and departed into the rain. Martin cleared their table, wiping away crumbs and restacking the condiments with mechanical precision. The diner fell silent again, except for the hiss of rain against the windows and the distant clatter of Joseph cleaning the kitchen. Helena emerged from the office, pulling on her coat. She looked at Martin with concern she tried to hide but never quite managed. She knew about his debts, had even offered to give him an advance on his pay, but Martin had refused, too proud or too stubborn to accept charity, even from someone who genuinely cared. Helena said good night, her voice soft, and reminded him to lock up properly. Martin nodded, assuring her he would. She paused at the door, turning back as if to say something more, but then thought better of it, and stepped out into the weather. Martin watched her hurry down the street, her umbrella bent against the wind, until she disappeared around the corner. He was alone now, except for Joseph, who would leave through the back door in another hour, once his prep work for tomorrow was complete. Martin moved through his closing routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times. He refilled salt shakers, checked that all the ketchup bottles were topped off, made sure the sugar dispensers were full. These small tasks gave him something to focus on, kept his mind from wandering into darker territories where worry about money and the future lived. He thought sometimes about leaving Riverside, starting fresh somewhere else, but the logistics felt impossible. He had no savings, no safety net, and the idea of accumulating more debt just to relocate seemed like jumping from one sinking ship to another. The rain continued its steady drumming on the roof, a sound that might have been soothing under different circumstances. Martin remembered rainy days from his childhood, sitting with his mother at the kitchen table while she helped him with homework, the smell of soup on the stove, and the warmth of simply being together. Those memories were precious now, small treasures he hoarded against the emptiness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm him. His mother had taught him to be kind, to treat everyone with dignity, regardless of their circumstances, and he carried that lesson with him even when kindness felt like a luxury he could barely afford. At 8:30, the door chimed again. Martin looked up, surprised that anyone would venture out in such weather. An old man stood in the doorway, rain dripping from a worn grey coat that had seen better decades. He was small and thin, with a face carved by time into deep lines and valleys. His hair was white and sparse, combed back from a high forehead, and his eyes were a pale blue that seemed both distant and strangely focused. He carried no umbrella, and his shoes, though clean, were cracked with age. He stood there for a moment as if gathering courage or perhaps just catching his breath, and then he moved slowly toward the counter. Martin straightened, his professional demeanor clicking into place. "Good evening," he said, his voice warm despite his fatigue. "Please, sit anywhere you like." The old man nodded but did not speak. He chose a stool at the counter, settling onto it with careful movements that suggested joints that no longer cooperated as they once did. Martin placed a menu in front of him and filled a glass with water, setting it down gently. The old man's hands were gnarled, spotted with age, and they trembled slightly as he reached for the water glass. He drank slowly, his throat working with each swallow, and then he set the glass down and looked at the menu without really seeing it. "What can I get for you tonight?" Martin asked, keeping his tone gentle. The old man looked up at him, and for a moment their eyes met. There was something in that gaze, a depth of sorrow or perhaps wisdom, that caught Martin off guard. "Just tea," the old man said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, rough as if he had not used it in some time. "And perhaps a piece of bread, if it is not too much trouble." Martin smiled. "No trouble at all," he assured him. "I will bring it right out." He moved to prepare the tea, selecting a clean cup and saucer, filling the kettle with fresh water and setting it to boil. He sliced a generous portion of bread from the loaf Helena baked fresh each morning, spreading it with butter and arranging it on a small plate. The old man sat quietly at the counter, his hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing in particular. Martin found himself wondering about the man's story, where he had come from, where he might be going, whether he had family waiting somewhere, or if he was as alone as Martin often felt. When the tea was ready, Martin brought it to the counter along with the bread. He set everything down carefully, adding a small pot of honey in case the old man wanted to sweeten his tea. The old man looked at the simple meal with an expression Martin could not quite read, something between gratitude and grief. He picked up the teacup with both hands to steady it, and took a small sip. "Thank you," he said, and those two words carried more weight than seemed possible. Martin returned to his tasks, giving the old man space and privacy to enjoy his modest meal. He could see him from the corner of his eye, eating slowly, each bite deliberate, as if he were savoring not just the food, but the act of sitting in a warm, dry place. The rain continued outside, the world beyond the diner's windows reduced to streaks of water, and the occasional passing headlight that briefly illuminated the street, before disappearing again into darkness. Josef emerged from the kitchen, his shift complete. He nodded to Martin, grunted something that might have been goodbye, and left through the back door. Now Martin was truly alone with the old man, the diner settling into a stillness broken only by the rain and the distant hum of the refrigerator units. Martin found himself moving more quietly, as if any loud noise might shatter something fragile in the air. The old man finished his bread and sat with his tea, holding the cup as if its warmth was the most valuable thing in the world. Time passed in that strange, suspended way it sometimes does late in the evening when the rest of the world feels distant and unreal. Martin checked the clock. 9:15. He should start hinting that closing time was approaching, but something stopped him. The old man was not bothering anyone, and Martin could not bring himself to rush him back out into the rain. So he waited, busying himself with unnecessary tasks, wiping down tables that were already clean, restocking napkin dispensers that were already full. Finally, at 9:30, the old man stirred. He reached into his coat pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, and pulled out a small leather wallet, cracked and faded with age. He opened it carefully and removed several bills, placing them on the counter. Martin approached, ready to calculate the modest bill. Tea and bread, practically nothing. But when he looked at the bills the old man had placed down, his breath caught in his throat. There were $500 there, crisp bills that looked almost new despite coming from such a worn wallet. "Sir," Martin said, his voice unsteady, "this is far too much. The tea and bread are only $5. The old man stood, his movements as careful as when he had sat down. He looked at Martin with those pale blue eyes, and this time Martin saw something in them he had not noticed before. A deep and abiding sadness mixed with something that might have been hope. "Keep it," the old man said quietly. "You have been kind to an old stranger on a difficult night. Kindness is rare and should be rewarded." "But, sir," Martin protested, "I cannot accept this. I was just doing my job." The old man shook his head slowly. "You did more than your job," he said. "You treated me with dignity. You did not rush me or make me feel unwelcome. In a world that often forgets old men like me, that matters more than you know." He buttoned his coat, preparing to face the rain again. Martin stood frozen, the money on the counter between them feeling like it weighed more than it should. "Who are you?" Martin asked, the question escaping before he could think better of it. The old man paused at the door. He turned back, and a small, sad smile touched his lips. "I am no one important," he said. "Just an old man settling accounts before it is too late." He pushed open the door and stepped into the rain, disappearing into the darkness before Martin could say another word. Martin rushed to the door, looking out into the night, but the old man was already gone, swallowed by the storm as completely as if he had never existed at all. Martin stood there for a long moment, rain blowing in through the open door, misting his face and arms. Finally he closed the door and locked it, turning back to the counter where the $500 still lay. His hands shook as he picked up the bills, counting them again to make sure he had not imagined it. $500, more than 2 weeks' wages. Enough to pay his landlord and buy himself some breathing room with the credit card company. But more than the money itself, it was the why of it that haunted him. Why had the old man given him so much? What did he mean by settling accounts? And why did Martin feel, deep in his bones, that this encounter meant something far more significant than a generous tip? He finished closing the diner in a daze, his mind spinning with questions. He walked home through the rain, the money tucked safely in his jacket pocket, feeling its weight with every step. When he reached his apartment, he sat on the edge of his narrow bed and counted the bills again, making sure they were real, that this was not some dream or hallucination born from exhaustion and stress. The money was real. The old man had been real. and something about the encounter felt like the beginning of something Martin could not yet name. A door opening to a story he did not yet know he was part of. Martin did not sleep that night. He lay in his narrow bed, listening to the rain finally taper off into silence, holding the $500 in his hands like a talisman against all the darkness that had accumulated in his life. When dawn finally crept through his single window, pale and gray, he was still awake, his mind churning through the encounter again and again, trying to extract meaning from every word the old man had spoken, every gesture, every glance. The money felt both like salvation and like a mystery that demanded solving, and Martin could not shake the feeling that accepting it meant accepting something larger, some responsibility or connection he did not yet understand. He rose at 6, showered in the cramped bathroom where the water never quite got hot enough, and dressed in his work clothes, jeans, and a blue shirt that had faded from too many washings. He made instant coffee in the tiny kitchenette, bitter and watery, and stood at the window watching Riverside wake up below him. The hardware store owner arrived to open his shop, Mr. Dvorak himself, the man Martin owed rent to, a stocky figure unlocking the front door and disappearing inside. Martin's stomach tightened with the familiar anxiety of debt, but for the first time in months, he had the means to address at least part of it. He tucked $400 into an envelope, writing Mr. Dvorak's name on the front in careful letters, and decided he would deliver it on his way to work. The morning air was crisp and clean after the rain, puddles reflecting the grey sky in shattered mirrors across the sidewalk. Martin walked the single flight of stairs down to the street and entered the hardware store, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. Mr. Dvorak looked up from behind the counter where he was sorting keys, his expression shifting from neutral to wary when he saw Martin. The landlord was a man in his 50s, with a thick mustache and eyes that calculated worth in practical terms. He had been patient with Martin, but patience had its limits, and they both knew those limits had been tested. Martin approached the counter and placed the envelope down between them. 2 months' rent, he said quietly. I am sorry it took so long. Mr. Dvorak picked up the envelope, opened it, and counted the bills inside with practiced efficiency. His eyebrows rose slightly, surprise registering in the set of his shoulders. This is good, he said, his tone softening just a fraction. This is very good, Martin. I was beginning to worry. Martin nodded, relief washing through him like cool water. I know, he said. I appreciate your patience. It will not happen again. Mr. Dvorak studied him for a moment, then offered something that might have been a smile. We all have difficult times, he said. I am glad yours might be improving. He tucked the money into his cash register and returned to his keys, the matter settled. Martin left the hardware store feeling lighter than he had in months, as if the simple act of paying what he owed had lifted some physical weight from his shoulders. He walked to the Blue Haven with a sense of purpose that had been absent from his steps for far too long. When he arrived, Helena was already there, brewing the first pot of coffee and setting up for the breakfast shift. She looked at him with that concerned expression she wore so often now, but Martin smiled at her, a genuine smile, and said good morning with something approaching enthusiasm. Helena's face brightened in response, and she asked if he was feeling all right, if something good had happened. Martin hesitated, unsure how to explain the encounter with the old man without sounding foolish or strange, so he simply said he had slept well and felt ready for the day, which was not entirely untrue, even if it was not the whole truth either. The breakfast shift passed in its usual rhythm, familiar customers ordering familiar meals, coffee flowing in steady streams, Joseph working his magic in the kitchen with eggs and bacon and pancakes. Martin moved through his tasks with renewed energy, finding satisfaction in even the smallest interactions, in refilling coffee cups and remembering how regulars took their cream and sugar, in clearing tables and wiping them clean for the next guests. But underneath the routine, his mind kept returning to the old man, to those pale blue eyes and that quiet voice speaking of settling accounts, to the feeling that something significant had shifted in his life, that the universe had reached down and touched him with some intention he could not yet decipher. During his break, Martin sat in the back room with a cup of coffee and pulled out his phone. He opened the search engine and typed in variations of his question, trying to find some explanation for the old man's generosity. Old man large tips, he searched. Then old man, generous stranger, then settling accounts meaning. The results were scattered and unhelpful. Stories of random acts of kindness, psychological articles about guilt and restitution, nothing that seemed to fit the specific weight of his encounter. He tried to remember every detail of the old man's appearance, the worn grey coat, the cracked shoes, the trembling hands, the way he had held the teacup as if it contained something more precious than simple warmth. Helena found him there, staring at his phone with an intensity that must have been visible on his face. She sat down across from him, her own coffee in hand, and waited with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes people needed space to find their words. Finally, Martin looked up at her and decided that keeping the encounter entirely to himself was doing him no good. He told her about the old man, about the modest meal and the extraordinary tip, about the cryptic words and the way he had vanished into the rain. Helena listened without interruption, her eyes growing wider as the story unfolded. When Martin finished, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. "That is remarkable," she said finally. "And strange. Did he give you any clue about who he was, or why he chose you?" Martin shook his head. "Nothing that made sense," he said. "He just said I had been kind, and that kindness should be rewarded. He said he was settling accounts." Helena frowned, turning those words over in her mind. "Settling accounts," she repeated. "That sounds like someone making peace with something. Someone trying to right old wrongs, perhaps. Did he seem ill, like maybe he was dying and wanted to do good before the end?" Martin considered this. He seemed old and tired, he said, but not necessarily sick. Just very sad, like he carried some great weight. Helena reached across the table and patted Martin's hand. "Whatever his reasons," she said, "he chose to give that money to you. Maybe you should accept it as the gift it was meant to be and not torture yourself with questions that may have no answers. You have been struggling, Martin. You are a good person who has had more than your share of hardship. Maybe this is just the universe balancing things out a little." Martin wanted to believe that, wanted to accept the money as simple good fortune, but something in him resisted. The encounter felt too deliberate, too weighted with meaning to be random chance. The old man had not stumbled into the diner by accident. He had come with purpose, and that purpose involved Martin specifically, though how or why remained maddeningly unclear. The afternoon brought fewer customers, the usual midweek lull that gave Martin time to think, perhaps too much time. He found himself watching the door, half expecting the old man to return, to walk back in and explain everything, to make sense of what felt increasingly like a puzzle Martin was meant to solve. But the old man did not come. Only the regular parade of travelers and locals passed through, people who knew nothing of Martin's encounter, and who went about their meals and their lives without any awareness of the mystery that had taken root in his mind. At 3 p.m, during the quietest part of the shift, a woman came into the diner who caught Martin's attention immediately. She was perhaps 60 years old, elegantly dressed in a manner that suggested money and taste, her hair styled in silver waves, and her posture carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being noticed. She sat at a booth near the window and studied the menu with the careful attention of someone for whom choice was always considered seriously. Martin brought her water and waited for her order. She asked for tea and a salad, her voice cultured and precise, and Martin nodded and turned to go. "Excuse me," she said, stopping him. "The young man who works here. You have been here for several years now, yes?" Martin turned back, surprised. "Yes," he said. 5 years. She nodded, as if this confirmed something. "My name is Eva Mares," she said. "I am a lawyer from the capital. I am looking for someone, and I wonder if you might help me." Martin felt a strange prickle run down his spine, some instinct warning him that this was connected to the old man, that his life was about to become even more complicated. "I will try," he said carefully. "Who are you looking for?" Eva Mares opened her purse and withdrew a photograph, old and slightly faded, protected in a plastic sleeve. She held it out to Martin. "This man," she said. "His name was Victor Novak. He would be in his 60s now, perhaps older. I have reason to believe he may have been in this area recently." Martin took the photograph with hands that had begun to tremble. He looked down at the image and felt the world tilt sideways beneath him. The photograph showed a man much younger than the old stranger from last night, but the eyes were the same. Those pale blue eyes that seemed to carry oceans of sorrow and regret. The face was less lined, the hair darker, but there was no mistaking the essential features, the shape of the jaw, the set of the shoulders. Martin looked up at Eva Mares, his mouth dry, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "This is my father," he said, the words coming out barely above a whisper. "Victor Novak is my father. He left when I was 4 years old. I have not seen him in 24 years. Eva Mares's expression shifted from professional inquiry to something deeper, sadder. She set down her purse and folded her hands on the table. "Then I am very sorry," she said, her voice gentle now, "to be the one to tell you this. Your father passed away yesterday morning. He died in a hospice 2 towns over. I am his attorney, and I have been looking for you because he left instructions that I was to find you and deliver something to you personally." Martin could not speak, could not move, could not process what he was hearing. His father was dead. The old man in the diner had been his father, returned after all these years only to leave again. This time, forever. Martin sat down heavily in the booth across from Eva Mares, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. The diner seemed to spin around him, sounds becoming distant and muffled as if he were underwater. Helena appeared beside him, her hand on his shoulder, asking if he was all right, her voice full of concern. Martin could not answer. He stared at the photograph still clutched in his hands, at the face of a man he had spent his entire childhood waiting for, a man who had finally returned only in the last hours of his life, disguised by age and illness and 24 years of absence. Eva Mares waited with professional patience, while Martin struggled to compose himself. Helena brought him water and sat beside him, her presence solid and comforting. Finally, Martin managed to look up at the lawyer. "He was here," he said, his voice raw. "Last night. He came into the diner during the rain. He ordered tea and bread. He gave me $500. Eva nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "He told me he was going to do that. He said he needed to see you one last time." to give you something, even if you did not know who he was. He was very ill, Martin. He had only days left, and he used what strength remained to find you and to make sure certain things were taken care of. Why did he not tell me who he was? Martin asked, anger beginning to surface through the shock. Why did he let me serve him tea like a stranger when he was my father? Why did he disappear again without explaining anything? Ava's expression was sympathetic but firm. He was afraid, she said simply. Afraid you would reject him. Afraid of causing you more pain. Afraid that after all these years, he had no right to ask for forgiveness or understanding. He made choices a long time ago that he regretted deeply, and he spent the last part of his life trying to make some kind of peace with those choices. Martin's hands clenched into fists on the table. He had no right to make that decision for me, he said. He had no right to come back and leave again without giving me a chance to speak to him, to ask him why, to tell him how his leaving destroyed my mother's life and mine. Ava did not flinch from his anger. You are absolutely correct, she said. He had no right. But he did it anyway, and now we must deal with what he left behind. She reached into her purse again and withdrew a thick envelope, official-looking with a law firm's letterhead embossed on the corner. This is for you, she said, sliding it across the table. Your father's will and several documents he wanted you to have. Martin stared at the envelope as if it might contain something dangerous. What is in it? He asked. Eva folded her hands. Your father owned property, she said. A house on the outskirts of town, the old Novak family home where he grew up and where your grandparents lived before they passed. He also had savings, not a fortune but a substantial amount, enough to change your circumstances significantly. He left everything to you. Additionally, there are letters, 3 of them. He wrote them over the past month as his condition worsened. He wanted you to understand, as much as anyone can understand, why he did what he did. Martin felt Helena's hand tighten on his shoulder. The old Novak house, she said quietly. I know that place. It has been empty for years. People said it was abandoned. Ava shook her head. Not abandoned, she said. Victor maintained it, paid all the taxes and utilities, kept it in good condition, even though he never lived there himself. He lived in the capital for most of the years after he left, working, saving, and apparently punishing himself for the choices he made. He only returned to this area 6 months ago when he became too ill to manage on his own. He checked into the hospice and began settling his affairs. Why did he leave in the first place? Martin asked. The question that had haunted him his entire life, finally directed at someone who might actually have answers. Ava sighed. That is explained in the letters, she said. It is not my story to tell. What I can say is that your father struggled with things that were beyond his control, demons, as your mother apparently called them. He believed, rightly or wrongly, that his presence in your lives was causing more harm than good. He thought leaving would give you and your mother a better chance at happiness and stability. He was wrong about many things, but his intentions, misguided as they were, came from a place of love. Martin wanted to throw the envelope back at her, to reject everything his father had left behind, just as his father had rejected him. But underneath the anger, there was something else, a desperate need to understand, to fill in the blank spaces of his history, to know the man who had shaped his life through absence as much as any present father shapes a child through presence. He picked up the envelope, feeling its weight, and tucked it into his jacket. I need time, he said. I need to think about all of this. Ava nodded. Of course, she said. Take all the time you need. My contact information is in the envelope. When you are ready to discuss the estate and the transfer of property, call me. There is no rush. Your father made sure everything was in order so that you would not have to deal with complicated legal processes during what he knew would be a difficult time. She stood, leaving money on the table for her untouched tea and salad. "I am sorry for your loss," she said, and she sounded like she genuinely meant it. "I know that is inadequate given the circumstances, but I am sorry nonetheless. Your father was a complicated man who made terrible mistakes, but in the end, he tried to do right by you in the only way he knew how." She left the diner, and Martin watched her walk to an expensive car parked outside, watched her drive away, taking with her the last physical connection to the father he had barely known. Helena closed the diner early that evening, something she had never done in all the years Martin had worked there. She called Joseph and told him not to come in. Then she sat with Martin in a booth and made him eat soup, even though he insisted he was not hungry. "You need to keep your strength up," she said firmly. "You have had a terrible shock, and you will need strength for what comes next." Martin ate mechanically, tasting nothing, his mind spinning through the revelations of the afternoon. His father had been alive all these years, living in the capital, working and saving, and apparently thinking about the family he had left behind. His father had come back, had looked him in the eye across the counter of this very diner, and had said nothing about who he was. His father had died knowing Martin did not recognize him. When he finished the soup, Helena made tea, strong and sweet, the way his mother used to make it when he was sick as a child. Martin held the cup and felt tears finally begin to flow, hot and bitter, tears he had not allowed himself to shed in years. Helena did not tell him to stop or that everything would be all right. She simply sat with him and let him cry, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of his emotions. After a long time, when the tears finally subsided, Martin opened the envelope Eva Maris had left. Inside were legal documents, property deeds, bank statements showing an account with nearly $80,000 in it, and 3 letters, each in its own smaller envelope, numbered 1 through 3 in his father's shaky handwriting. Martin held the first letter but could not bring himself to open it. Not yet. Not here. He needed to be alone, in his own space, to read whatever his father had written. He gathered everything back into the large envelope and stood on unsteady legs. Helena hugged him, something she had never done before, and told him to take tomorrow off, that he should rest and process everything that had happened. Martin thanked her, his voice hoarse from crying, and walked out into the evening air. The streets of Riverside were quiet, the sun setting behind buildings in shades of orange and pink that seemed absurdly beautiful, given the darkness of the day. Martin climbed the stairs to his apartment, feeling like he was carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. The studio that had felt cramped and depressing just that morning now seemed like a refuge, a small, safe space where he could fall apart without witnesses. He locked the door behind him and stood in the center of the single room, the envelope from Eva Maris still clutched in his hand. The light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows across the floor, and Martin did not bother turning on any lights. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the envelope for a long time, before finally opening it again and removing the first letter. The envelope was sealed with tape, yellowed slightly with handling. Martin peeled it open carefully and withdrew several pages covered in handwriting that was clearly his father's, shaky in places but still legible, each letter formed with obvious effort. Martin took a deep breath and began to read. "My dear son," the letter started, and those 3 words alone were enough to make Martin's eyes burn with fresh tears. "I am writing this, knowing that by the time you read it, I will be gone. I have tried many times over the years to find the courage to contact you directly, to explain myself, to ask for forgiveness I know I do not deserve. But courage failed me every time, and now time itself has run out." Martin's hands trembled as he continued reading. His father's words were careful, measured, each sentence clearly thought through multiple times before being committed to paper. "I left you and your mother when you were 4 years old," Victor wrote. "This is a fact that has defined your life and mine in equal measure, though in very different ways. You grew up without a father, and I have lived knowing that my absence shaped you in ways I can never undo. Your mother was a good woman, the best woman I ever knew, and she deserved so much better than what I gave her. You deserved better than what I gave you. There is no excuse for what I did. But there is an explanation, and I hope you will allow me to give it even though I have no right to ask for your understanding." The letter went on to describe Victor's life before Martin was born, before he met Anna. Victor had grown up in Riverside in the old family house, the son of hard-working parents who ran a small farm on the outskirts of town. He had been a good student, quiet and thoughtful, planning to go to university and study engineering. But during his final year of secondary school, something happened that changed the trajectory of his entire life. His best friend, a boy named Thomas, who had been like a brother to him, died in an accident. They had been working together on the farm, repairing a piece of equipment, when something went wrong. Thomas was killed instantly, crushed beneath machinery that should have been properly secured. Victor was there when it happened, close enough to see but too far to help. And the image of his friend's death burned itself into his mind with such intensity that it never faded. Victor wrote about the guilt that consumed him afterward, the irrational but overwhelming belief that he should have been able to prevent what happened, that he should have checked the equipment more carefully, that he should have insisted they wait for help instead of trying to fix it themselves. The guilt transformed into something darker, a depression that wrapped around him like chains and would not let go. He started having nightmares, panic attacks, episodes where he could not breathe or think clearly. This was 29 years ago, the letter explained, and mental health was not something people talked about openly. There was no counseling available in a small town like Riverside, no resources for a young man struggling with trauma. People told him to be strong, to move on, to forget about it, and focus on his future. Victor tried to do exactly that. He went to university as planned, threw himself into his studies, and tried to outrun the darkness that chased him. He met Anna in his second year, and she was like sunlight breaking through clouds, warm and genuine, and full of life. She made him laugh, made him feel like maybe he could be normal again, like maybe the past did not have to define his future. They married young, perhaps too young, and when Anna became pregnant with Martin, Victor felt something like hope for the first time since Thomas's death. He thought that becoming a father would give him purpose, would anchor him to the present, and help him leave the past behind. But the opposite happened. When Martin was born, Victor's depression returned with renewed force. He would wake in the night from nightmares and be unable to go back to sleep, lying in the darkness, listening to his infant son breathe and being terrified that something would happen to him, that he would fail to protect him the way he had failed to protect Thomas. The fear became obsessive, paralyzing. Victor started having intrusive thoughts, terrible images of accidents and injuries and losses that his mind conjured with cruel detail. He knew these thoughts were not rational, but knowing that did not make them stop. He began to withdraw from Anna and Martin, afraid that his presence was somehow cursed, that his darkness would contaminate them. Anna tried to help. She begged him to see a doctor, to talk to someone, to let her in so they could face whatever was wrong together. But Victor was too ashamed, too convinced that his struggles were a personal failing rather than an illness that could be treated. He started drinking to quiet the thoughts, to numb the constant anxiety that ate at him from the inside. The drinking made everything worse. He became unreliable, missing work, snapping at Anna over small things, unable to be the husband and father he desperately wanted to be. He watched himself destroying the family he loved and felt powerless to stop it. One morning, when Martin was 4 years old, Victor woke up after a particularly bad night and realized that he was going to hurt someone. Not intentionally, not violently, but through his sheer inability to function, through the chaos his mental state was creating in their home. He looked at his sleeping wife and his small son and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He packed a single bag, left a note that explained nothing because he did not have words for what was happening inside him, and walked away. He told himself it was temporary, that he would get help, get better, and come back. But temporary became permanent, and the shame of leaving became too heavy to overcome. Martin set down the first letter. His vision blurred with tears. His father had been sick, mentally ill at a time when such things were barely acknowledged or treated. His father had left not because he did not love them, but because he was drowning and did not know how to ask for help. Martin felt anger and grief and pity all tangled together, a knot of emotions too complex to separate. He picked up the second letter, needing to know more, needing to understand the rest of the story, even though each word felt like it was carved into his skin. The second letter was shorter than the first, but its words carried even more weight. Victor described the years after he left, years spent drifting from city to city, taking whatever work he could find, construction jobs and factory shifts, and anything that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. He eventually settled in the capital, finding steady work as a maintenance supervisor in a large office building. The job was solitary, night shifts mostly, cleaning and repairing things while everyone else slept. It suited him. He did not have to interact with many people or pretend to be normal when he felt anything but normal. For the first few years, Victor wrote, he convinced himself that Anna and Martin were better off without him. He sent money when he could, anonymous deposits to Anna's bank account that he hoped would help, but never included a return address or any explanation. He told himself that providing financial support from a distance was better than being present and dysfunctional. But as time passed and Martin grew older, Victor began to understand that his reasoning had been deeply flawed, that his absence had caused a different kind of damage, perhaps worse than his presence ever could have. Victor finally sought help for his mental health when he was in his late 30s, nearly a decade after leaving his family. He found a doctor in the capital who listened without judgment and explained that what Victor had been experiencing was severe anxiety and depression, likely triggered by unprocessed trauma from witnessing his friend's death. The doctor prescribed medication and recommended therapy. Victor did both, and slowly, painfully slowly, he began to heal. The nightmares decreased. The intrusive thoughts became less frequent. He learned coping mechanisms, ways to manage the anxiety when it flared up, techniques for grounding himself when panic threatened to overwhelm him. But even as Victor got better, he could not bring himself to reach out to the family he had abandoned. Too much time had passed. Martin would be a teenager by then, nearly grown, and what could Victor possibly say that would justify his absence? How could he explain that he had been sick when his sickness had looked like cowardice and abandonment? He imagined the anger and hurt that Anna must feel, that Martin must feel, and he could not face it. So he stayed away, watching from a distance, keeping track of their lives through whatever small pieces of information he could gather. Victor hired a private investigator once, just to know that they were all right. The investigator reported back that Anna was working 2 jobs, but managing, that Martin was doing well in school, that they lived in a small house on the edge of Riverside and seemed to be coping despite the hardships. Victor felt relief and shame in equal measure. Relief that they had survived without him, shame that they had needed to survive at all. He increased the anonymous deposits, trying to make up with money for what he could not give in person, knowing even as he did it, that money was a poor substitute for presence and love. Years continued to pass. Victor kept working, kept saving, kept living a half-life defined by regret and loneliness. He never remarried, never formed close relationships, never allowed himself the comfort of connection because he felt he did not deserve it. He followed Martin's progress through school, learning somehow that Martin had been accepted to university, feeling pride mixed with sorrow that he had missed watching his son grow into a young man. When Anna got sick, Victor knew about it before Martin did. The investigator he still employed occasionally had mentioned seeing Anna at the hospital, looking frail and diminished. Victor wanted desperately to help, to reach out, to do something, but he remained paralyzed by shame and fear. Anna died without ever knowing that Victor had kept track of her all those years, that he had mourned her from afar, that he had never stopped loving her, even though he had failed her so completely. Victor attended her funeral, standing far back where Martin would not see him, watching his son grieve and hating himself for every choice that had led to this moment. He saw Martin drop out of university to care for his mother during her illness, saw him take the job at the Blue Haven diner, saw him struggle with debt and hardship, and Victor understood that his absence had created consequences that rippled forward through time, shaping Martin's life in ways that could never be undone. The letter continued with Victor's explanation of how he had finally developed the courage, or perhaps the desperation born of terminal illness, to return to Riverside. 6 months ago he had been diagnosed with advanced cancer, aggressive and untreatable. The doctors gave him less than a year. Victor knew this was his last chance to try to make things right, or at least less wrong. He checked into the hospice 2 towns over, not wanting to burden Martin with his presence, but needing to be close enough to see him one more time. He hired Eva Maris to arrange his affairs, to make sure that everything he owned would go to Martin, to try to provide some measure of security for the son he had failed in every other way. Victor had gone to the Blue Haven diner 3 times before the rainy evening when Martin finally served him. The first 2 times, Victor had lost his nerve and left before entering. He would stand outside in the darkness, watching Martin work through the window, seeing in his son's face echoes of Anna and echoes of himself, and the weight of all those lost years would crush him until he had to walk away. But on the 3rd evening, the rainy evening, Victor knew he was running out of time. His pain was getting worse, his body failing rapidly, and if he did not go in that night, he might never get another chance. So Victor had entered the diner, had sat at the counter, had let Martin serve him tea and bread. He had looked into his son's eyes and seen kindness there despite the weariness, had seen the good man Martin had become, despite having no father to guide him, and Victor had felt both pride and devastating regret. He had wanted to speak, to say the words that had been trapped inside him for 24 years, to ask forgiveness and offer explanation. But fear had silenced him one last time. Instead, he had left the money, hoping that it would at least make Martin's life a little easier, hoping that the letters he had written would explain what he could not say in person. Martin set down the 2nd letter and stood, pacing the small apartment, his emotions too large for the confined space. He felt angry at his father for leaving, angry at him for staying away so long, angry at him for coming back only to die without revealing himself. But he also felt a deep, aching sadness for the broken man his father had been, for the illness that had stolen so much from all of them, for the years of suffering his father had endured alone. Martin understood now that his father's leaving had not been about not loving them. It had been about a sickness that his father had not known how to fight, about shame and fear and a tragic misunderstanding of what family means. Martin did not sleep that night either. He read the third letter as dawn approached, and this one was different from the first two. It was shorter, written in handwriting that was even shakier, clearly composed in the final days of Victor's life, when holding a pen must have required immense effort. "My son," it began, "if you are reading this, then you know the truth about why I left and why I stayed away. I do not expect you to forgive me. I do not expect you to understand fully, because I am not sure I understand fully myself, even after all these years, and all the therapy, and all the time spent trying to make sense of the choices I made. What I want you to know," Victor wrote, "is that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life, not because of what I lost, though I lost everything that mattered, but because of what I took from you. I took away your right to have a father. I took away your mother's partner when she needed one most. I took away years that can never be recovered, moments that should have been hours together. I was sick, yes, and I did not know how to ask for help. But that does not erase the harm I caused. It only explains it." The letter continued with Victor expressing his hope that the money and the house would provide Martin with some stability, some foundation to build a better future. "The house holds memories," Victor wrote, "some painful and some beautiful. My parents died there, your grandparents whom you never got to know because of my failures. But it is also where I was happy as a child, where I dreamed of the future before everything went wrong. I have kept it maintained all these years, thinking perhaps that someday I might find the courage to invite you there, to show you where you came from, to give you roots that I denied you. That day never came, but the house is yours now. Do with it what you will." Victor also wrote about specific memories he treasured from the brief time he had been Martin's father. He remembered Martin taking his first steps, stumbling across the living room floor and laughing when he fell. He remembered reading stories at bedtime, Martin's small, warm body curled against his side, asking for just one more chapter. He remembered teaching Martin to count using blocks, the boy's serious concentration as he carefully stacked each one. These memories were all Victor had of his son's childhood, and he had replayed them countless times over the years, trying to hold on to something real when everything else felt like dust and regret. The letter ended with a request. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," Victor wrote, "but I will ask anyway. Please do not let my mistakes define your life the way they defined mine. You are a good man, Martin. I saw that in how you treated an old stranger with kindness and dignity. Your mother raised you well, better than I ever could have. You have her strength and her compassion. Do not carry anger and bitterness forward the way I carried guilt and shame. Live fully. Love deeply. Build the life I failed to build. And if you can, remember that I loved you, even if I loved you badly and from too far away. That is all. That is everything. Your father, Victor." Martin held the letter for a long time after finishing it, tears streaming down his face unchecked. The apartment was filled with grey morning light, another day beginning whether he was ready for it or not. He felt hollowed out, scraped raw by emotion, but underneath the pain, there was something else emerging, a strange kind of peace. His father had not abandoned him because Martin was unlovable, or because Victor did not care. His father had been broken by trauma and illness, and had made terrible choices from that brokenness. It did not make those choices right, but it made them understandable in a way Martin had never imagined possible. He thought about his mother, about how she had never spoken badly of Victor, how she had always maintained that his leaving was about his own struggles and not about them. Anna had understood something that Martin was only now beginning to grasp, that people can love you and still fail you, that mental illness can make someone act in ways that seem unforgivable, but come from a place of pain rather than malice. His mother had carried that understanding alone, protecting Martin from bitterness while quietly mourning the man she had lost. Martin finally stood and looked at the papers Eva Maris had left. The house deed showed property on Meadow Lane, a road that ran along the edge of town where old farms gradually gave way to forest. He remembered passing that area as a child, but had never paid much attention to the houses there. The bank statements showed the account in Victor's name, with instructions for it to be transferred to Martin Novak upon Victor's death. $80,000. It was more money than Martin had ever imagined having, enough to pay off every debt, enough to start over, enough to finally breathe. But the money felt complicated, weighted with meaning beyond its practical value. It represented 24 years of Victor working and saving, trying to make up for his absence with accumulated wealth. It represented guilt and regret, transformed into something tangible. Martin was not sure how he felt about accepting it. Part of him wanted to refuse it all, to send it back or donate it somewhere, to reject this final gift from a father who had given him nothing else. But another part of him, the practical part that had been struggling for so long, recognized that refusing the money would not change the past. It would only make his future harder. He decided to visit the house before making any decisions about what to do with it. He needed to see it, to stand in the space where his father had grown up and where his grandparents had lived and died. He needed to connect to some part of his history that had been hidden from him all his life. Martin showered and dressed, made coffee that he barely tasted, and left his apartment as the town was waking up around him. The morning was clear and cool, the sky washed clean by the recent rain, and the air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Meadow Lane was a 15-minute walk from his apartment, a journey that took him past the diner where Helena would be opening up for the breakfast shift, past the hardware store where Mr. Dvorak was already sweeping the sidewalk, past the small park where mothers were beginning to arrive with their children. Martin nodded to people he recognized, but did not stop to talk. He was on a mission, following a pull he did not fully understand toward a place he had never been, but which was somehow essential to who he was. The Novak house stood back from the road, partially hidden by tall trees that had been planted long ago as a windbreak. It was a solid 2-story structure built of brick and wood, its design simple and practical in the way of old farmhouses. The paint was fresh, white with dark green shutters, and the small yard was neatly maintained. Martin stood at the end of the gravel driveway, staring at the house, trying to imagine his father as a child running across this yard, climbing those trees, entering through that front door after school, trying to imagine his grandparents, whom he had never known, people who should have been part of his life, but had died while Victor was busy running from his past. Martin walked up the gravel driveway slowly, each step feeling significant in a way he could not quite articulate. The house seemed to watch him approach, its windows reflecting the morning sun like eyes that had seen too much. He reached the front porch, a wide wooden structure with a swing that moved slightly in the breeze, and found the key Eva Mares had included with the documents. His hand trembled as he inserted it into the lock, and when the door opened, he stood on the threshold for a long moment, before stepping inside. The interior smelled of lemon polish and old wood, clean but not sterile, lived in despite years of absence. The furniture was covered with white sheets, ghostly shapes in the front room that had once been a living space where a family gathered. Martin pulled back one sheet to reveal a sofa, old-fashioned but well-maintained, its fabric a faded floral pattern that spoke of another era. He moved through the downstairs rooms, the kitchen with its vintage appliances and worn countertops, the dining room with a heavy oak table that could seat 8, the small study lined with bookshelves still filled with volumes whose spines were cracked with age and use. Everything was neat, orderly, preserved as if Victor had been maintaining a museum of his past rather than a home. Martin climbed the stairs to the second floor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. There were 3 bedrooms, 2 of them clearly belonging to his grandparents, based on the photographs on the dressers, black and white images of a couple whose faces Martin studied with hungry intensity. His grandmother had kind eyes and a gentle smile. His grandfather looked stern, but with laugh lines around his mouth that suggested hidden humor. These were people he should have known, whose laps he should have sat on as a child, whose stories should have been part of his inheritance. The 3rd bedroom was smaller, clearly Victor's childhood room. The bed was narrow, the desk by the end, window simple and functional. A bookshelf held textbooks from secondary school, novels with yellowed pages, and a few trophies from academic competitions. Martin sat on the edge of the bed and looked around, trying to see his father in this space, trying to understand the boy who had lived here before tragedy and mental illness had reshaped his entire life. On the desk, Martin noticed something that made his breath catch. A wooden box, simple but beautifully made, with his name carved into the lid. Martin Novak. The letters were precise, carved with care and skill. Martin reached for the box with hands that shook. He opened it and found it filled with items that took him several moments to comprehend. There were photographs, dozens of them, documenting his entire life from birth to the present. Martin as a newborn in Anna's arms. Martin taking his first steps. Martin on his first day of school, wearing a backpack almost as big as he was. Martin at his university acceptance ceremony, smiling broadly beside his mother. Martin, working at the diner, this photograph clearly taken from outside through the window, recent enough that Martin recognized the shirt he was wearing. His father had been documenting his life all along, collecting these moments like treasures, watching from a distance, but never truly absent. Beneath the photographs were report cards from Martin's school years. How Victor had obtained these, Martin could not imagine. But there they were, every single one from primary school through secondary school, some with his mother's handwritten notes in the margins. There were newspaper clippings too, a small article about Martin making the honor roll, another about his acceptance to university, even one about the diner where he worked mentioning the staff by name. Victor had been collecting pieces of his son's life, building a portrait from fragments, staying connected in the only way he knew how. At the bottom of the box, Martin found a journal. It was leather-bound, worn from handling, and when he opened it, he recognized his father's handwriting immediately. The entries began the day Victor left and continued sporadically through the years, documenting his thoughts, his regrets, his observations about Martin from afar. Martin read random entries, each one a window into his father's tortured mind. March 12th, 2008, one entry read. Saw Martin playing in the park today. He is 7 now, so tall and strong. He was laughing with other children, and I felt relief that he seems happy despite my absence. But I also felt crushing guilt. He should not have to be happy despite me. He should be happy with me. I am a coward for not approaching him, for not trying to explain. But what would I say? How do you tell a 7-year-old child that his father is broken? Another entry from years later. August 3rd, 2015. Martin started university today. I stood in the crowd of parents watching the orientation ceremony. I saw Anna there, looking so proud, and I wanted to go to her, to stand beside her and share that pride. But I stayed hidden, like always. Martin looked nervous, but excited. He has grown into a fine young man, despite having no father to guide him. This is Anna's doing entirely. She is stronger than I ever was. I hope Martin knows how lucky he is to have her. The entries continued through Anna's illness and death. Victor had written about watching from the back of the funeral, about seeing Martin's grief, about wanting desperately to comfort his son, but being paralyzed by shame and fear. He wrote about the guilt of knowing that Martin had dropped out of university to care for Anna, that he was struggling with debt, that the life he could have had was being sacrificed. Victor had been aware of everything, suffering alongside them but separately, connected by observation but divided by his own inability to bridge the distance he had created. The final entries were from the last few months, written as Victor's illness progressed. He wrote about making arrangements with Eva Mares, about organizing his affairs to make things as easy as possible for Martin. He wrote about his decision to visit the diner, about his fear and his determination. The very last entry was dated the day before Victor died. I saw my son tonight, it read. I sat across from him, and he served me tea with kindness and grace. He did not recognize me. 24 years, and my own son did not know my face. But I saw in him the man I hoped he would become. Anna raised him right. He is good and kind, despite all the hardship he has faced. I gave him money because it is all I can give now. Tomorrow I will die, and he will learn the truth, and I hope he can find some way to understand. I hope he can forgive me. But if he cannot, I hope he at least knows that I loved him every single day. I loved him when I left, and I loved him from afar, and I love him now as I prepare to leave him again. This time, permanently. Martin, if you find this journal, know that you were never forgotten. You were always in my heart, even when I was not in your life. Martin closed the journal and sat in the silence of his father's childhood room, tears streaming down his face. The anger he had been carrying began to dissolve, replaced by a profound sadness for his father, for his mother, for himself, for all the lost time that could never be recovered. His father had been watching over him all along, documenting his life, staying connected in secret, suffering alone with his regrets. It did not make the abandonment right, but it made it human, made it the act of a broken man trying to cope with something beyond his capacity to manage. Martin stood and walked to the window, looking out over the yard where his father had played as a child. He thought about the cruelty of mental illness, how it could take a good person and twist their life into shapes that hurt everyone, including themselves. He thought about his mother, who had understood this and had protected Martin from bitterness. He thought about second chances and forgiveness, about whether it was possible to forgive someone who was no longer alive to receive that forgiveness. And he realized that forgiveness was not really about his father anymore. It was about Martin himself, about choosing to release the weight of anger and resentment so he could move forward unencumbered. He gathered the box with all its contents, the photographs and report cards and newspaper clippings and the journal, and carried it downstairs. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where his grandparents had eaten meals and where his father had done homework as a boy, and he felt a connection to his past that had been missing his entire life. This house was his heritage. These stories were his history. And this complicated legacy of love and loss and regret was his inheritance. He could reject it, or he could embrace it, and either choice would shape the rest of his life. Martin spent the next 3 days at the house on Meadow Lane, barely leaving except to buy groceries and tell Helena that he needed more time before returning to work. Helena understood without needing detailed explanations, telling him to take all the time he needed, that the diner would survive without him for a few days. Martin wandered through the rooms of his father's house, slowly removing the white sheets from furniture, opening windows to let fresh air circulate, bringing the space back to life after its long sleep. He read through his father's journal multiple times, each reading revealing new layers of pain and love and regret that Victor had documented so carefully. The house began to feel less like a museum and more like a home, or at least like a place that could become a home if Martin chose to make it one. He found himself making small repairs, tightening a loose doorknob, oiling hinges that squeaked, replacing a burned-out light bulb. These simple tasks gave him something concrete to focus on, while his mind processed the enormity of everything he had learned. He thought constantly about his father, about the man Victor had been before trauma broke him, about the decades of suffering he had endured alone, about the courage it must have taken to finally come to the diner that rainy night, even if he could not reveal himself. On the 4th day, Martin received a phone call from Eva Mares. She asked if he had visited the house and if he had found the wooden box. Martin confirmed that he had, his voice still rough with emotion when he spoke about it. Eva was quiet for a moment before telling him there was one more thing Victor had arranged, something she had been instructed to reveal only after Martin had time to process the letters and explore the house. Martin's stomach tightened with apprehension. What else could there possibly be? He asked. Eva suggested they meet at her office in the capital the following day. She said it was something that needed to be explained in person, something important that Victor had wanted Martin to understand before making any decisions about the estate. Martin agreed to the meeting, curiosity and dread mixing in equal measure. That evening he called Helena and told her he would be away one more day, but would return to work the day after. Helena asked if he was all right, if he needed anything, and Martin found himself telling her the entire story, about the letters and the journal and the photographs, about his father watching from a distance all those years. Helena listened without interrupting, and when Martin finished she was quiet for a long moment. "Your father made terrible choices," she finally said, "but he never stopped being your father in his heart. That has to count for something." Martin was not sure if it counted for enough, but he appreciated her words nonetheless. The next morning, Martin borrowed Helena's car, an old sedan that rattled but ran reliably, and drove the 2 hours to the capital city. He had not been there since dropping out of university, and seeing the tall buildings and crowded streets brought back memories of a different life, a life where he had been a student with dreams and possibilities stretching endlessly before him. Eva Maris's office was in a modern building downtown, all glass and steel, and when Martin entered he felt distinctly out of place in his simple clothes among people in expensive suits moving with purposeful urgency through the marble lobby. Eva met him in a conference room on the 15th floor, her expression professionally warm, but with an underlying seriousness that made Martin nervous. She offered him coffee, which he accepted, and they sat across from each other at a polished table that reflected the ceiling lights. "Thank you for coming," Eva said. "I know this has been an incredibly difficult time for you, and I appreciate your willingness to hear what your father wanted me to tell you." She opened a folder and withdrew several documents, arranging them carefully before her. "Your father's estate is more complicated than the initial documents showed," she said. The house and the savings account are yours without question. But there is something else. Something Victor struggled with, whether to include in his will. Martin leaned forward, his attention fully focused. "What is it?" he asked. Ava took a breath. "Your father had a life insurance policy," she said. "A substantial one. He took it out 20 years ago and has been paying premiums faithfully ever since. The beneficiary is you." Martin frowned, not understanding why this would require a special meeting. "That is generous," he said slowly, but why did he struggle with whether to include it? Ava's expression grew more serious. "Because the policy is worth $1.2 million, she said, "and your father was not sure if receiving that much money all at once would help you or hurt you." The number hung in the air between them, so large that Martin could not immediately comprehend it. $1.2 million. Combined with the savings account, that would be nearly $1.3 million total. More money than Martin had ever imagined having, more money than he could conceptualize. He stared at Ava, his mouth open, unable to form words. Ava continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Victor worried that such a large sum might overwhelm you, that it might make you feel obligated to him in ways that would be unhealthy. He worried that you might see it as him trying to buy forgiveness or assuage his guilt with money. So he left instructions with me to evaluate your reaction to the initial inheritance before revealing the insurance policy." "And what was your evaluation?" Martin managed to ask. Eva met his eyes. "My evaluation is that you are a thoughtful, grounded person who has been shaped by hardship but not broken by it. I believe you will use this money wisely, not to escape your problems, but to build a better foundation for your future. Your father hoped that this inheritance would give you the freedom to pursue dreams you had to set aside, to create the life he wanted for you, but could not give you himself." Martin felt tears threatening again, a seemingly endless well of emotion that kept rising no matter how many times he thought he had cried himself dry. Ava slid the insurance documents across the table. "The policy will pay out once the death certificate is processed and the claim is filed," she said. "That will take approximately 30 days. In the meantime, you should think about what you want to do with this money." Victor included a letter with the policy, one more letter he wrote just for this purpose. She handed Martin a sealed envelope, and he recognized his father's handwriting on the outside. "For Martin, when he learns about the insurance policy," it read. Martin tucked the envelope into his jacket, not ready to open it here in this sterile office with Eva watching. He would read it later, in private, where he could process its contents without witnesses. "Thank you," Martin said, his voice barely steady. "Thank you for handling all of this with such care." Eva smiled, a real smile this time, warm and genuine. "Your father was a client, yes," she said, "but more than that, he was a man trying desperately to do one thing right after a lifetime of things done wrong. It was an honor to help him, and it is an honor to help you now." They concluded the meeting with discussions of paperwork and timelines, practical matters that grounded Martin back in reality. When he finally left the office and stepped out into the city streets, he felt disoriented, as if he had stepped into someone else's life. Martin walked aimlessly through the capital for hours, the envelope from his father in his pocket, feeling like it weighed more than its actual mass. He found himself in the university district, walking past buildings where he had once attended classes, seeing students who looked impossibly young, rushing between lectures with backpacks and coffee cups, and the unconscious confidence of people who still believed the future was guaranteed. He had been one of them once, before his mother got sick, before he had to choose between his education and his family. The choice had not felt like a choice at all. But now, with his father's inheritance making it possible to return if he wanted. Martin wondered what that younger version of himself would think of where he had ended up. He found a quiet park and sat on a bench beneath old trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn with the first hints of autumn. He opened the envelope and withdrew the letter inside. This one was typed rather than handwritten, suggesting Victor had composed it earlier when his hands were steadier. "Martin," it began, "if you are reading this, then Eva has told you about the insurance policy, and you know that I have left you more money than most people see in a lifetime. I imagine you are overwhelmed, perhaps angry that I am once again complicating your life from beyond the grave. Let me try to explain my reasoning." Victor wrote about his years of working and saving, about how every dollar he accumulated felt like a small act of penance for his absence. But he also wrote about realizing that simply leaving money behind was not enough, that Martin deserved an explanation of what he hoped that money would accomplish. "I do not expect this money to make up for my failures," Victor wrote. "Nothing can do that. What I hope is that it will give you freedom, freedom to choose your own path without being constrained by debt or necessity, freedom to go back to university if you wish, or to start a business, or to travel and see the world, or simply to live without the constant anxiety of financial insecurity that has plagued you since your mother died. Your mother and I," Victor continued, "we wanted you to have opportunities, to build a life filled with purpose and joy and achievement. I destroyed those opportunities when I left. I am trying now, inadequately and far too late, to restore at least some of what I took away. This money comes with no strings, no expectations, no obligations. You do not owe me gratitude or forgiveness or even acknowledgement. This is simply what a father should do, provide for his child, and I am doing it now because I failed to do it when it mattered most. Use this money however you see fit. Build the life you deserve. And if you can, remember me not for my failures, though they were many and grievous, but for the fact that I never stopped loving you and never stopped hoping you would be happy." Martin sat on that bench for so long that the afternoon faded into evening and the park lights flickered on one by one. He read his father's letter 3 more times, each reading bringing new waves of emotion that he had to process before moving forward. The money was real. The inheritance was real. The possibility of a completely different future was suddenly, startlingly real. But with that reality came a weight of responsibility that felt almost crushing. What did he want to do with his life now that he had the means to choose freely? Who was he when survival was no longer the only consideration? He thought about his mother, about how proud she had been when he was accepted to university, how she had sacrificed so much to give him opportunities she never had. He thought about the dreams he had set aside when she got sick, dreams of becoming an engineer, of designing things that would make people's lives better, of using his mind in ways that mattered. Those dreams had seemed dead and buried under the necessity of daily survival, but now they stirred again, fragile but persistent, like seeds that had been waiting for the right conditions to sprout. Martin also thought about the diner, about Helena, who had been kind to him when he needed kindness, about the regular customers who knew his name and asked about his life, about the simple satisfaction of serving food and making people feel welcome. There was dignity in that work, purpose in those small acts of service. Part of him did not want to leave it behind, did not want to abandon the life he had built, even if that life had been shaped by limitation rather than choice. But another part of him whispered that staying at the diner when he no longer had to, when he had resources to pursue something more aligned with his education and abilities, would be a waste of the very freedom his father had tried to give him. As darkness settled fully over the city, Martin made his decision. He would not make any hasty choices about the money. He would take time to think carefully about what he truly wanted, what would honor both his mother's sacrifices and his father's belated attempt at providing. But he would start by finishing what he had begun all those years ago. He would return to university, complete his degree, reclaim the path that had been interrupted. After that, with education and options restored, he could decide what came next. The decision felt right in a way that settled something restless inside him, gave him direction when everything had felt chaotic and overwhelming. Martin drove back to Riverside as night deepened around him, the highway mostly empty, his mind clearer than it had been in days. When he reached the town limits, instead of going to his apartment, he drove to the house on Meadow Lane. It was fully dark now, but he had left lights on inside, and the house glowed warmly against the night. He parked in the driveway and sat for a moment looking at it. This place that had been waiting for him all his life without his knowledge, this inheritance of brick and wood and memories that was now his to care for. Inside, Martin went directly to the study where he had found his father's journal. He sat at the old desk and pulled out a notebook, one of several blank ones he had found in the drawers. He needed to write, to process everything through the act of putting words on paper, to create some record of this transformative time that he could look back on later. He wrote about the rainy evening when the old man had come into the diner, about learning his identity, about the letters and the journal and the photographs. He wrote about his anger and his grief and his slowly growing understanding of his father's struggles. He wrote about his mother, too, about her strength and her quiet wisdom, about how she had carried the burden of Victor's absence without letting it turn her bitter. Anna had understood something profound about forgiveness and grace, about loving someone despite their failures, and Martin realized he was only now beginning to learn the lessons she had tried to teach him through her example. He wished desperately that she was still alive, that he could talk to her about all of this, that she could help him make sense of the complicated tangle of emotions he was experiencing. But perhaps she had known this day would come eventually. Perhaps that was why she had always spoken of Victor with compassion rather than condemnation, preparing Martin for the moment when he would have to choose between resentment and understanding. As Martin wrote, filling page after page with his thoughts and feelings, he felt something shift inside him. The anger that had been a constant companion since learning his father's identity began to loosen its grip. It did not disappear entirely, might never disappear entirely, but it no longer felt like it defined him. In its place grew something more complex, a mixture of sadness for what had been lost, gratitude for what had been given, and determination to use this unexpected inheritance not as a way to escape his past, but as a foundation to build a future that would honor everyone who had shaped him, including the father who had loved him so imperfectly from such a distance. The next morning, Martin woke in his father's childhood bed, sunlight streaming through windows he had opened the night before. He had fallen asleep while writing, the notebook still open beside him, and for a moment upon waking, he felt disoriented, unsure where he was. Then, memory returned, and with it a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for so long. He had decisions to make, actions to take, a future to actively shape rather than simply endure. The weight of that responsibility was balanced by a lightness he had not felt in years, the knowledge that he finally had choices. Martin showered in the old-fashioned bathroom upstairs, the water pressure weak but steady, and dressed in clean clothes he had brought from his apartment. He made coffee in the kitchen using a percolator he found in one of the cabinets, the smell rich and comforting as it filled the house. While the coffee brewed, he walked through the rooms again, this time seeing them not as a museum of his father's past, but as a space he might actually inhabit, might make his own. The house was large for one person, but it felt solid and safe, rooted in a way his small apartment never had. After breakfast, Martin drove to the Blue Haven diner. It was mid-morning, between the breakfast rush and the lunch crowd, and Helena was restocking supplies when he entered. She looked up, and her face brightened with genuine pleasure at seeing him. "Martin," she said, coming around the counter to embrace him briefly. "I am so glad you are back. How are you? Are you all right?" Martin smiled, surprising himself with how natural it felt. "I am getting there," he said. "It has been the strangest week of my life, but I think I am finally starting to understand some things." They sat in a booth, and Martin told Helena everything, about the insurance policy and the total inheritance, about his decision to return to university, about the house and how it felt to stay there. Helena listened with the full attention she always gave when something mattered, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Your father gave you a gift," she said. "Not just the money, though that is significant. He gave you back your choices. That is what real love does. It creates space for the people we care about to become who they are meant to be." Martin felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I wish he had given me the chance to thank him," he said. "I wish I had known who he was that night." Helena squeezed his hand. "Maybe he could not bear to see rejection in your eyes," she said. "Maybe giving you everything while asking for nothing in return was the only way he knew how to love you at the end. It is not fair to you, and it is not what should have happened, but perhaps it is all he could manage." Martin nodded, accepting the truth of her words, even though they did not erase the sadness of missed opportunities. He took a breath and told Helena something he had been thinking about since the previous night. "I am going to quit the diner," he said. "I am going back to university to finish my degree. But I want to do something first. I want to use some of the money to help you renovate this place, to update the equipment and the decor, to give the Blue Haven a chance to compete with the newer restaurants that have been taking your business." Helena's eyes widened. "Martin, you do not need to do that," she said. "Your money should go toward your education and your future." Martin shook his head. "You gave me steady work when I needed it most," he said. "You were patient and kind, and never made me feel like I was wasting my potential by serving coffee and clearing tables. You treated me with dignity. Let me do this for you. It is not charity. It is gratitude. And besides, it would make me happy to know that this place will still be here, thriving, long after I have moved on to whatever comes next." Helena's eyes filled with tears. She tried to protest again, but Martin could see she was touched, that the offer meant more to her than she wanted to admit. The diner had been struggling, and they both knew it. An infusion of capital for renovations could make a real difference, could bring back customers who had drifted away to flashier establishments. Finally, Helena nodded. "All right," she said. "But only if you let me pay you back eventually, even if it takes years." Martin agreed, knowing that giving Helena the dignity of repayment, even if he never actually needed the money returned, was important. They spent the next hour discussing plans, Helena's ideas pouring out now that possibility had been opened. New booths and tables, a modernized kitchen that would make Joseph's work easier, better lighting, a fresh coat of paint, perhaps even a small patio area for outdoor seating in good weather. Martin watched her face come alive with enthusiasm and felt a deep satisfaction in being able to give this to someone who had given him so much. When they finally finished planning, Helena hugged him again, longer this time. "You are a good man, Martin Novak," she said. Your mother would be so proud of you, and I think, despite everything, your father would be proud too. Martin left the diner feeling lighter than he had in years. He drove to the registrar's office at the regional university campus and inquired about readmission procedures. The administrator he spoke with was helpful, explaining that his previous credits were still valid and that he could potentially complete his engineering degree in 2 years if he took a full course load. Martin filled out the application paperwork right there, his hands steady, his purpose clear. He would start in the winter term, just a few months away. It was enough time to settle his affairs in Riverside, to get the diner renovations started, to move fully into the house on Meadow Lane, and make it truly his. As Martin drove back to the house that afternoon, he felt something he had not experienced in so long he barely recognized it. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone drowning and grasping for anything to keep afloat, but the solid, grounded hope of someone who could see a path forward and had the means to walk it. His father had given him that, this man who had failed him in so many ways, but who had, in the end, found a way to provide what mattered most. Not just money, though the money was transformative, but the message behind the money, the implicit statement that Martin's dreams and potential were worth investing in, that he deserved to build the life he had once imagined for himself. The next morning, Martin woke in his father's childhood bed, sunlight streaming through windows he had opened the night before. He had fallen asleep while writing, the notebook still open beside him, and for a moment upon waking he felt disoriented, unsure where he was. Then memory returned, and with it a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for so long. He had decisions to make, actions to take, a future to actively shape rather than simply endure. The weight of that responsibility was balanced by a lightness he had not felt in years, the knowledge that he finally had choices. Martin showered in the old-fashioned bathroom upstairs, the water pressure weak but steady, and dressed in clean clothes he had brought from his apartment. He made coffee in the kitchen using a percolator he found in one of the cabinets, the smell rich and comforting as it filled the house. While the coffee brewed, he walked through the rooms again, this time seeing them not as a museum of his father's past, but as a space he might actually inhabit, might make his own. The house was large for one person, but it felt solid and safe, rooted in a way his small apartment never had. After breakfast, Martin drove to the Blue Haven diner. It was mid-morning, between the breakfast rush and the lunch crowd, and Helena was restocking supplies when he entered. She looked up, and her face brightened with genuine pleasure at seeing him. "Martin," she said, coming around the counter to embrace him briefly. "I am so glad you are back. How are you? Are you all right?" Martin smiled, surprising himself with how natural it felt. "I am getting there," he said. "It has been the strangest week of my life, but I think I am finally starting to understand some things." They sat in a booth, and Martin told Helena everything about the insurance policy and the total inheritance, about his decision to return to university, about the house and how it felt to stay there. Helena listened, with the full attention she always gave when something mattered, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Your father gave you a gift," she said. "Not just the money, though that is significant. He gave you back your choices. That is what real love does. It creates space for the people we care about to become who they are meant to be." Martin felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I wish he had given me the chance to thank him," he said. "I wish I had known who he was that night." Helena squeezed his hand. "Maybe he could not bear to see rejection in your eyes," she said. Maybe giving you everything while asking for nothing in return was the only way he knew how to love you at the end. It is not fair to you, and it is not what should have happened, but perhaps it is all he could manage. Martin nodded, accepting the truth of her words, even though they did not erase the sadness of missed opportunities. He took a breath and told Helena something he had been thinking about since the previous night. "I am going to quit the diner," he said. "I am going back to university to finish my degree, but I want to do something first. I want to use some of the money to help you renovate this place, to update the equipment and the decor, to give the Blue Haven a chance to compete with the newer restaurants that have been taking your business." Helena's eyes widened. "Martin, you do not need to do that," she said. "Your money should go toward your education and your future." Martin shook his head. "You gave me steady work when I needed it most," he said. "You were patient and kind, and never made me feel like I was wasting my potential by serving coffee and clearing tables. You treated me with dignity. Let me do this for you. It is not charity. It is gratitude. And besides, it would make me happy to know that this place will still be here, thriving, long after I have moved on to whatever comes next." Helena's eyes filled with tears. She tried to protest again, but Martin could see she was touched, that the offer meant more to her than she wanted to admit. The diner had been struggling, and they both knew it. An infusion of capital for renovations could make a real difference, could bring back customers who had drifted away to flashier establishments. Finally, Helena nodded. "All right," she said. "But only if you let me pay you back eventually, even if it takes years." Martin agreed, knowing that giving Helena the dignity of repayment, even if he never actually needed the money returned, was important. They spent the next hour discussing plans, Helena's ideas pouring out now that possibility had been opened. New booths and tables, a modernized kitchen that would make Joseph's work easier, better lighting, a fresh coat of paint, perhaps even a small patio area for outdoor seating in good weather. Martin watched her face come alive with enthusiasm and felt a deep satisfaction in being able to give this to someone who had given him so much. When they finally finished planning, Helena hugged him again, longer this time. "You are a good man, Martin Novak," she said. "Your mother would be so proud of you. And I think, despite everything, your father would be proud too." Martin left the diner feeling lighter than he had in years. He drove to the registrar's office at the regional university campus and inquired about readmission procedures. The administrator he spoke with was helpful, explaining that his previous credits were still valid and that he could potentially complete his engineering degree in 2 years if he took a full course load. Martin filled out the application paperwork right there, his hands steady, his purpose clear. He would start in the winter term, just a few months away. It was enough time to settle his affairs in Riverside, to get the diner renovations started, to move fully into the house on Meadow Lane, and make it truly his. As Martin drove back to the house that afternoon, he felt something he had not experienced in so long he barely recognized it. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone drowning and grasping for anything to keep afloat, but the solid, grounded hope of someone who could see a path forward and had the means to walk it. His father had given him that, this man who had failed him in so many ways, but who had, in the end, found a way to provide what mattered most. Not just money, though the money was transformative, but the message behind the money, the implicit statement that Martin's dreams and potential were worth investing in, that he deserved to build the life he had once imagined for himself. 3 months passed in a blur of activity and change. The Blue Haven diner underwent its transformation. New equipment installed in the kitchen, fresh paint on the walls in warm colors that made the space feel inviting rather than tired, comfortable new booths, replacing the cracked vinyl ones that had been there for decades. Joseph actually smiled when he saw the updated kitchen, a rare expression on his usually stoic face. Helena cried happy tears the day they reopened, customers flooding back to see the changes, many commenting that the diner felt renewed while still maintaining the character that had made it a community gathering place for so many years. Martin spent his final weeks in Riverside, preparing for his return to university. He kept his apartment until the end of his lease, but moved most of his belongings to the house on Meadow Lane, slowly making it his own while respecting the history embedded in its walls. He hung new curtains his mother had made years ago that he had kept in storage, placed photographs of Anna throughout the rooms, so her presence remained even in this space she had never seen. He also kept some of Victor's things, the journal and the box of photographs, the old books from the study, tangible connections to a father he was learning to understand, and slowly to forgive. The insurance money came through as Eva Maris had promised, and Martin found himself staring at bank statements that still did not feel entirely real. He paid off every remaining debt, the credit cards and medical bills that had haunted him for years, experiencing a lightness when those balances finally read 0. He set aside money for tuition and living expenses for the next 2 years. He funded the diner renovations, as he had promised Helena, and he donated a substantial sum to a mental health organization that provided counseling services to people who could not afford them, doing it anonymously but doing it in his father's name. A small act that felt like honoring both Victor's struggle and his attempt at redemption. Winter arrived with its first snow the week before Martin was scheduled to move to the capital to start classes. He spent his last evening in Riverside at the diner, not working but sitting at the counter as a customer, something he had rarely done in all his years of employment there. Helena served him coffee and pie, joking that he would always be terrible at sitting still and letting others serve him. Regular customers stopped by his stool to wish him well, people whose names he knew and whose usual orders he could recite from memory. Mr. Dvorak came in and shook his hand, telling him that paying rent on time for 3 months straight had been much appreciated. Even Joseph emerged from the kitchen to nod at Martin with something that might have been respect or might have been his version of affection. As the evening wound down and the last customers departed, Martin helped Helena clean up one final time, the rhythm of the work familiar and comforting. They worked in companionable silence, and when the diner was ready for the next day, Helena turned off most of the lights and they sat together in a booth by the window. "You are going to do great things," she said quietly. "I always knew you were meant for more than this place, even though I was grateful to have you here." Martin felt his eyes sting. "This place gave me dignity when I had very little," he said. "It gave me purpose when everything else had fallen apart. I will never think of it as less than." Helena smiled. "Your father would be proud," she said. "I know that might not mean much given everything that happened, but I believe it is true. He would be proud of the man you have become and the choices you are making." Martin nodded, surprised to find that her words did mean something, that he had reached a place where his father's hypothetical pride could touch him without triggering only anger and pain. Victor had been broken and had made terrible choices from that brokenness, but he had also been human, struggling with demons that were beyond his ability to control. Martin understood now that holding on to resentment would not change the past. It would only poison his future, and he refused to let that happen. The next morning, Martin loaded his car with everything he would need for the semester. The house on Meadow Lane would remain his, a place to return to during breaks, an anchor connecting him to his history and his family. He stood on the porch for a long moment, looking at the street where his father had played as a child, where his grandparents had built a life, where his own story had unexpected roots. Then he got in the car and drove toward the capital, toward the university, toward the future that had been delayed but never truly lost. Classes started on a Monday in January, and Martin walked into his first engineering lecture, feeling both nervous and exhilarated. He was older than most of the other students, his face showing the marks of hardship they had not yet experienced, but his determination matched or exceeded theirs. He threw himself into his studies with an intensity born from knowing exactly how precious this opportunity was, how easily it might never have come at all. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying, engaging his mind in ways he had almost forgotten were possible. On weekends, Martin would sometimes take out his father's journal and read through the entries again, each time finding new understanding in Victor's words. He started writing responses in his own notebook, letters to a father who would never read them, but which helped Martin process his complicated feelings. He wrote about forgiveness, about how it was not a single moment, but an ongoing choice, a practice that required conscious effort. He wrote about gratitude for the inheritance that had changed his life, and about sadness for all the moments they had never shared. He wrote about moving forward while carrying the past, not as a burden, but as part of the foundation that made him who he was. Spring came, and with it a sense of renewal that felt almost too perfect, too much like a metaphor. But Martin embraced it anyway. He was thriving in his classes, making friends, building the life he had once dreamed of. He visited Riverside regularly, having dinner with Helena, checking on the diner, which was now consistently profitable again. He maintained the house on Meadow Lane, spending time there during breaks, slowly making it feel less like his father's house and more like his own, while never erasing the history that lived in its walls. One warm evening in late spring, Martin sat on the porch swing and watched the sun set over the trees his grandfather had planted decades ago. He thought about his mother, about how she had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. He thought about his father, about the complicated legacy of love and failure he had left behind. He thought about Helena and Joseph and Mr. Dvorak, and all the people who had been kind to him when he needed kindness. And he thought about himself, about the journey from despair to hope, about how a single rainy evening and a quiet old man's tip had set in motion events that had transformed his entire life. Martin pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app, where he had been drafting something for weeks. He read through it one more time, then posted it to a grief support forum he had been following. Sometimes, he wrote, the people who hurt us most are the ones who were hurting most themselves. Sometimes, forgiveness is not about excusing what happened, but about refusing to let the past determine the future. My father abandoned me when I was 4 years old. He came back 24 years later, disguised as a stranger, and left me an inheritance that changed my life. I am still learning to forgive him. I may always be learning, but I am also learning to be grateful for complicated gifts from complicated people, and to build something good from the broken pieces I was given. If you are struggling to forgive someone who failed you, know that it is okay to take your time. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is one of the hardest and bravest things we can do. He posted the message and closed his phone, setting it aside. The sun had fully set now, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Martin rocked gently on the swing, feeling the evening breeze, feeling at peace in a way that once seemed impossible. His father had been right about one thing in his final letter. The inheritance had given Martin freedom, not just financially but emotionally, the freedom to choose who he wanted to be and how he wanted to live. And Martin had chosen to honor everyone who had shaped him by building a life filled with purpose and compassion and the kind of quiet courage it takes to forgive the unforgivable and to keep moving forward even when the past weighs heavy. He had chosen, in the end, to let kindness be his legacy, passed down from a mother who had loved him unconditionally, and a father who had loved him imperfectly, but had tried, in his final days, to give his son the one thing he needed most, a second chance at the future.